So we're in the middle of this series called What Would Jesus Undo? And we're looking at each gospel, each week, and seeing what happens after the resurrection of Jesus, and seeing what that tells us about what in our lives and what in the world and what in our culture that Jesus might undo, that the resurrection of Jesus undoes. So on Easter Sunday, we looked at how the resurrection of Jesus was the undoing of death. Last week, we looked at the undoing of fear, and this morning, we're looking at the undoing of failure, which is good news for me because I am very familiar with failure. That's why it's a great thing that I'm preaching this sermon. Maybe you are like me and know a little bit about failure. When I was in school, I was actually not a failure. I was a pretty good student, which didn't mean that I was a good person, and actually didn't even mean that I was very smart. Eventually, you come to learn that good grades don't necessarily correlate to virtue or even intelligence, but I didn't know that at the time, so I thought that because I got good grades, I was kind of a genius. So my junior year of college, I was applying for all of these prestigious scholarships with names like Rhodes and Fulbright, and because I was a genius, I just fired off these applications and sent them off to my faculty advisor, and a couple of days before kind of the next step in this process, he called me because he was so affected by what I wrote that he told me that I should probably just start over completely. But what did he know? I was a genius, so I didn't do anything differently. And I remember then a couple weeks later, I was at this interview with all these faculty members, and they're asking me about my application. And it was a very profound experience of slowly having the realization dawn on me that I had no idea what I was talking about. And it was very clear that this interview was a train wreck. So that was a very humbling experience, but not nearly as humbling as the next scene I will cut to, where I was at my job. I worked at this breakfast place in college, and I'm there, and in walks the whole faculty committee of this scholarship team, and they're walking in with the winner of the award in order to celebrate. And of course, as though it were written in a script, they were seated in my section. And so I was the one who got to be the waiter for the winner of this application that I had, a scholarship I had applied for. And so I was getting ready to go up. I'm like, oh, this is going to be so awkward. But it turned out it wasn't that awkward because nobody even remembered me. So it was sort of a perfect parable of failure. And this morning we're going to be looking at another meal where the air is thick with failure. It comes in the Gospel of John after Jesus has called his disciples from their boats. They were fishing on the Sea of Galilee, calls them on the beach, and grills them some fish. And then at the end of the meal, this conversation begins, which you can find on page 992 if you want to follow along. It's John chapter 21, verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." So imagine how confusing the resurrection must have been. When I read these stories, because I know what happens and I know what's coming next, it's really easy for me to forget that the disciples weren't secretly rooting for this resurrection like some kind of comeback story or like an encore at a concert that you kind of know is coming. The account that the Bible has of the disciples is that they were basically always confused and disoriented. They were doubting. They were fearful at the resurrection of Jesus. They were trying to piece together what it must have meant. And especially for Peter, Peter must have been walking around with an enormous unresolved burden, this heavy feeling of failure, anytime he saw Jesus after the resurrection, because this conversation that he had just a few days before would have been in his mind. This is from John chapter 13, when they're all in the upper room at the Last Supper, and Jesus is telling them that they can't go where he's going, and Peter said, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And sure enough, when it got hot, Peter melted. And he completely failed. He did exactly what Jesus predicted. And so I can imagine that every time Jesus and Peter crossed paths, this conversation crossed Peter's mind. In fact, the resurrected Jesus would have been for Peter, I imagine, like this walking, talking reminder of this huge failure in Peter's life. Yeah, Jesus is risen, but Peter must have still felt like a failure. So Jesus kicks back from the table at the end of the meal, and he says, "Simon, Peter, son of John, do you love me more than these?" More than these what? Some people think he was talking about the boats and the nets and the fishing gear that was Peter's kind of defined Peter's identity, these symbols of his capability and his control, the life that he knew and was familiar with. Peter, do you love me more than these things? Or it could have been, do you love me more than you love these other disciples? Do you love me the most? Or it could have been, do you love me more than these other disciples do? The text doesn't actually tell us which is the angle Jesus is getting at, and I actually like leaving them all open so that we can find ourselves in that question regardless of our own circumstance. I think the most important thing is the first part of the question. Do you love me? Isn't it interesting that in the face of failure, this is the question Jesus wants to ask? Do you love me? He doesn't ask Peter, have you learned your lesson? He doesn't ask Peter, how are you going to make it up to me? He doesn't ask Peter, how are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because that's not the most important question for Jesus. The most important question in the face of failure is not a performance-oriented question. It's a question about relationship. Do you love me? We live in a performance-oriented and failure-phobic culture. It begins at the very beginning, when as young parents we purchase toys for our children from a company called Baby Einstein. Talk about setting your kid up for failure. And then it doesn't really ever let up. As soon as you're done applying for your magnet high school or your private high school, as soon as you've kind of come up for air as a student from that, it's time to start applying for college. And you kind of have this hope when you're growing up that when you're an adult, whatever that means, you will have arrived and you won't feel like a failure. You'll feel competent and that you know what you're doing. But there is not one parent in this room that doesn't know what it feels like to feel like a failure. There's many of us who know what it means to have bombed that sales presentation, to have lost the contract, and have beaten ourselves up over it. We live in a culture that tells us that failure equals disaster, that if you fail, it's the end. And so we're actually miscalibrated. And we sometimes think that things are failures when we're not, like the student that feels like a failure because he got an A-. This is not Peter's situation. Peter is not suffering from a miscalibrated sense of failure. Peter promised big things to Jesus, and he failed big time. This was not that circumstances were conspiring against him, or that he just forgot this one little detail, or that he could explain his way out of it. This was epic, mega failure, betrayal, abandonment of his closest friend. This was a significant failure, and it's here that Jesus poses this question: do you love me? Peter failed big time, and sooner or later, or maybe already, so will we. So have we. There's going to be graduation speeches given all over the country in the next several weeks, and very few of them are going to actually tell the truth and say that in life, failure is a virtual guarantee. Maybe in big ways, maybe in small ways, maybe in ways we don't even notice. But we will be failures at something. And I think what Jesus is saying to Peter and what he's saying to us today is, because of the resurrection of Jesus, even your worst failure is not final. Because Jesus goes on, and he asks this question, this important "do you love me" question 3 times, and Peter picks up what he's referring to. In verse 17, when he asks him the 3rd time, it tells us Peter was hurt, because he gets what Jesus is doing. Jesus is asking these 3 questions: do you love me? To gently remind and correspond to the 3 denials that Peter had. But you see what Jesus is doing? As he's bringing out this great failure into the light, he's doing it at the same time that he's restoring Peter to a great responsibility. Because as soon as he says, "Do you love me?" Feed my sheep. Take care of my sheep. Feed my lambs. See, Jesus knows that the ironic way, the only way out of this burden of failure is actually to face it and to recognize it and to acknowledge it. And so he gently leads Peter into this recognition as he is restoring him to this role, this purpose that Jesus has for his life. And he does it for Peter, and he does it actually for all of the disciples. He won't let them stay in that place of failure. Brings it out into the light, reminds them of what's true, and asks them not about their performance, but about their love for him. So where in your life or in your past or in your circumstances right now have you felt the heavy weight of failure? Maybe it was professional or academic failure. Maybe it was relational failure. Maybe it was moral failure. Just think about that for a moment. Bring it out into the light in your mind. The question Jesus wants to ask you in the face of that failure is not, have you learned your lesson? It's not, what are you going to do to make sure this never happens again? It's not, how are you going to make this up for me? The most important question Jesus wants to ask you in the face of your failure is, do you love me? Because if you love this Jesus, then you know that what Jesus does with situations of failure is redeem. I mean, this is the resurrected Jesus who's talking. And just a few days ago, he went to the cross, which was the ultimate sign and symbol of a failed life. He turned crucifixion into salvation. He turned execution into resurrection. And so Jesus is in the business of taking human failure upon himself and redeeming it and restoring and reshaping and redirecting that life into an entirely new and different direction. This is the resurrected Jesus talking. He knows what failure is like, and he knows that it's not final. So as we trust him and we leave our failures in his hands, his nail-scarred hands, failure begins to mean something different. Because Peter was being restored to a role of being one of the most influential leaders in the most influential movement the world has ever known. That's where Jesus took him out of this place thick with failure. And he goes on to say to him, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." The earliest historical sources tell us that probably around the year 64, under the Emperor Nero, Peter himself was crucified in Rome, possibly upside down. And by the time John had written this gospel, that would have been known by many people. And so John goes on to confirm in verse 19, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter, watch this, would glorify God. See, after the resurrection, even crucifixion means something completely different. Jesus has turned around crucifixion so that it's not just an execution that is to exhibit the shame to be heaped on the criminal. Now it is even crucifixion becomes something by which God can be glorified. And so it is with our failures. They don't have to mean what we think they mean. God is in the business of entering into those places and working and bringing redemption, reshaping, restoring, and redirecting us to a new kind of life. And I love how the last words Jesus speaks to Peter in this passage are the very same words he spoke to Peter the first time he met him by the sea. It's the same invitation that's offered. Follow me. He asks him, "Do you love me? Because if you love me, your failure is not final. So come along. Let's enter into this new life that my death and resurrection opens up." And I think the invitation that Peter is offered at the end is the same invitation that we are offered, even in the face of our failure, especially in the face of our failure. It's because we are failures that Jesus went to the cross. So because of our failure, Jesus asks us, "Do you love me? Because if you love me, your failure is not final. So follow me."